Joining us now, member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. Good to have you on.
So, Senator Blumenthal, we led today. Obviously, we could talk about Paris. We have spoken about Paris, but we led today with two more stories that I'm sure you're going to have to look at, and your Senate colleagues are going to have to look at. One was Michael Isikoff's story that the Trump administration feverishly was trying to work behind the scenes to get Russian sanctions lifted without letting anybody else know that. And the second story was that Jared Kushner met this Russian spy who happened to run a bank that connected to Vladimir Putin.
With conflicting
and the Russians say it was about him getting money for his business, and the Americans are saying it was about diplomacy. What's your take on those two explosive stories?
What is most striking about all of these discussions with the Russians, whether by Michael Flynn or Jeff Sessions, now the Attorney General, or Jared Kushner, is the concealment afterward. They not only had these secret discussions before Donald Trump took office, but also then concealed them, possibly lied about them in clearance forms. And now we need to know exactly what was discussed. That's why I've advocated that Jeff Sessions be brought back before the Judiciary Committee and that Jared Kushner come clean, in effect, and talk about what was discussed in those secret meetings that then were not disclosed. Perhaps his security clearance ought to be reviewed, and his briefings, the security briefings that he has every morning, ought to be suspended. But the Judiciary Committee and the Intelligence Committee ought to continue their review so that we get to the bottom of exactly what was discussed and why there was this pattern of concealment of the secret discussions with the Russians.
Mark Halperin.
Senator, based on the facts as we know them now, what's your theory of the case about what was going on between the Trump team and the Russians, both during the election and during the transition?
My strong guess or suspicion is that there was discussion about lifting the sanctions, encouraging Russians to think that the sanctions, in fact, would be abrogated once Donald Trump came into power, which undermined then President Obama's policy of coming tough with the Russians because of Ukraine, because of their violation of the INF Treaty, because of their testing us around the world. And what is striking here is the betrayal of Republican principles and values, as you said earlier, and the fact that the Russians really are testing us successfully around the world, and I think need to be held to account.
Senator, what are the top two questions Senate Democrats want to hear from Director Comey when it comes to Capitol Hill?
What's really important to hear from Director Comey is, in his words, whether he will confirm the accounts that have been reported very reliably and credibly about Donald Trump's demand for loyalty, the pledge of loyalty that he asked Comey to give, the request by Donald Trump to shut down the Flynn investigation, and what the tone and substance of those discussions was. So the question is, what did Donald Trump say to him, and what did he say to Donald Trump, and what other discussions were there that involved apparently Donald Trump's effort to shut down the investigation of Flynn, perhaps to shut down the investigation entirely of Russian meddling and collusion with the Russians by the Trump campaign.
Katty Kay.
Senator, the White House's response to the Yahoo story that State Department officials were pressurized by the White House to draw up plans to roll back sanctions against Russia very early on in the administration is that they were looking at plans for sanctions for all countries across the board, and there was nothing unusual about this. What do you read into that story, and how significant is it in the context of all of these meetings that we keep hearing about?
There is a real consensus in Congress, at least among many of my colleagues, on a bipartisan basis, that sanctions against Russia need to be intensified, not diminished. And that was the trend that the Obama administration was following, however haphazardly, and many of us criticized the lack of more intensified sanctions under the Obama administration. Now, when we see the apparent initiative on the part of the Trump transition team to send a signal that these sanctions would be lifted, it is a very, very dismaying prospect. And I think that it calls for a bipartisan effort, and I'm certainly helping to lead it, to increase the sanctions through legislation. We have a bill, and I hope it will continue on a bipartisan basis.
Jeremy Bash.
Senator, as a former Attorney General, let me ask you a legal question. If the president tries to assert executive privilege to block Comey's testimony, what will be your response?
The response, very simply, is the President of the United States has waived that privilege. He's talked about those conversations publicly. If there ever were a privilege, and I would say legally there isn't, in these circumstances, it was waived by the president when he talked about those conversations. But even more practically important, how would it ever be enforced? Is the President of the United States really going to try to go to court to muzzle Jim Comey as he appears before the Senate Intelligence Committee? I don't think so, and he should not do so. The President of the United States ought to be cooperating, not characterizing these investigations as a witch hunt or a charade. He should want the truth to come out to the American people, and whether it's President Bannon or President Trump, they ought to be cooperating and supporting these investigative efforts, not just the special prosecutor. And I called for a special prosecutor early and repeatedly to do the criminal investigation, but also the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee, so that we prevent this kind of Russian interference in our democratic institutions in the future. Reports and recommendations are tremendously important. The president ought to be a willing and cooperative party to that effort.
Whether that president, again, as he said, is President Bannon or President Trump. Senator,
always
thank
have
you
to
so
wonder.
much
Thank you,
from the
Senator.
great state of Connecticut. It's great to have you on. Mark Al. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.